back at the flat, when they lifted floorboards, they found stains which are likely from blood pooling, the size of dinner plates.
Which is crazy if you think about like how much blood it will have been that's dripped through the floor as well.
We're talking about multiple stains.
Yeah. Just a quick disclaimer, the content presented in this podcast is based on real events and may contain graphic descriptions of violence, crime scenes and other disturbing material. Listener discretion is advised. This episode is sponsored by Think Forensic.
Think Forensic are a one-stop shop for all things forensic science and crime solving. They hold experience days, as well as corporate events, team building events, and general education for primary school right the way up to university level, as well as other events and consultancy. There's also a shop where you can get your hands on all things crime solving, from evidence gathering to packaging and collecting evidence, as well as other forensic science equipment.
For more information or to book on an experience day, please visit the website. Hi everyone and welcome back to episode 2 of the Grave Secrets podcast. We're your hosts, I'm Annie.
And I'm Beth. Today we've got another case study for you. We're going to jump straight into it today. And we're looking at a case which took place in Scotland today.
A bit further away than we normally go for.
It is, yeah. One of my favourite places, though. So I'm excited to cover. Excited? Is that all right?
Yeah.
To cover this one. This case, again, is one that I hadn't heard of, but it did create huge headlines at the time pretty quickly due to the manner in which the victim's body was discovered, but then also the controversy around the case, which obviously we'll be explaining.
I think just the shocking nature of the crime in itself, and when we go into it, you'll be like, that is very... I found it very shocking just to watch or listen to.
Yeah. What made this case even more horrific is that Barry Wallace, the victim in this case, was just 18 when he was first reported missing. And he was reported missing after failing to return home after his work Christmas party.
I know, and just how many times have we gone on a work Christmas party and you've gone out for a few more drinks after, and you go to get a taxi home, don't you? And you might say bye to your friends while you're getting different taxis. Yeah. And that was no different to what he did on that night.
No, and you wouldn't think anything of it, would you?
No.
It was his parents that reported him missing, but obviously we'll explain more. But yeah, ultimately this investigation would then cross countries, create headlines and uncover really horrific truths about the killer.
I think it will have done a lot as well in terms of linking the police and the way the police do stuff. Maybe the processes and protocols after this case, you think it doesn't really work like this now. So it sort of shows how policing's developed as well over time.
Yeah, definitely. I think they dealt with it really well, but you're completely right. There's a lot more protocols now that make it a lot easier than these guys had it at the time.
Yeah.
So we're going to start at the 7th of December in 1999. Again, it's not that long ago, really, is it? Do you know what I mean?
It's not. But then I was thinking as well, in 1999, the victim, Barry, will probably not have had a mobile phone to ring a taxi. No. He will not have been able to check in with his friends and say, oh, I've got home safe like we do. Yeah. Do you know what I mean? It is a total different generation, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, I'd not really thought about that.
Yeah.
So a police dive team would regularly use the locks around the area that they were working within, and some locks are bigger than others, and some are obviously more popular with tourists and locals, and some are quite quiet. So in this case, a team of 7 or 8 police divers from the Central Scottish Divers were on a routine training exercise on Loch Lomond. Now, again, we're not obviously pronouncing it as well as anyone who Scottish is, but please forgive us for any pronunciations that we butcher.
We are trying.
Yeah. So Gordon Dick is one of the divers that was on this routine exercise, and he's been interviewed in a number of different documentaries and things. And he said that it is quite a large loch, so it's 22 miles wide. No, long and then 4 miles wide.
It's huge, isn't it? When you think about putting that into perspective, I always think 22 miles, how long would it take me to drive 22 miles?
Yeah,
so that's here to like Manchester.
Yeah, and it's also like length of time, isn't it, if you were to drive? Yeah. So huge, and then 190 metres deep. So again, quite deep, which made it perfect for these routine dives because, like he said, you've got a good depth to get to, you've got a lot of water to cover, and they could practice all of their exercises there. So they went to the loch, and it was easy access because there was quite a long pier, and it was quite derelict, which I obviously loved from seeing the footage of it.
Yeah, because it showed you, when I looked at it, it showed like an aerial view.
Yeah.
And flying over it really put into perspective not just how big it was, but how remote this area was as well.
Absolutely.
It didn't feel like there was anything around there at all, did there?
No, quiet location. It's obviously not going to get interrupted. And they get into the water, and quite quickly they noticed there were like black bin bags under the water. Obviously they're diving, so they see them pretty quickly. And so one of the team decided, obviously, to open one of the bags.
And they're used to finding lots of stuff when they do these practice dives. So you can imagine when they go down to the bottom, they're finding, rubbish, they're finding maybe animals, everything that just gets thrown in, or, they're going to find a lot of stuff in there in general. So when they first found these bags, it wasn't as if, oh God, we found something in here, we need to quickly get it out. I think they just opened it out of curiosity, didn't they, really?
Yeah. And again, they said that sometimes for these exercises, they didn't know whether it had been like set up for them to discover things.
Yeah.
So again,
bit of a test.
Part of their training.
Yeah.
But quite quickly, one of the divers noticed and said, I'm pretty sure that this is a human leg. This is a limb, and it is a human limb. So obviously then they are all on high alert, and there's numerous bags. So now they are concerned with opening each of these bags. So the first limb that was found was later identified as being a thigh, and then another diver opened the other bag and discovered a human arm. And you just think, again, you've got quite an easy morning, probably, as a diver.
Oh, you were doing a training exercise.
And then all of a sudden...
Yeah, you come across this.
Shifted.
Yeah, so the in the bags, in all of the black bags that they brought up, there were limbs. Yeah, in every one that they opened. But then if you've got the limbs, you know that something sinister has happened in this situation for severed limbs to end up in the bottom of the loch.
And the fact that they're in black bin bags means that it must be murder.
Someone's disposed of them.
Actually put them in the bags rather than it just being, an animal.
So in terms of like an identification for something like this, you'd get all the bags from the bottom, look through them and see what you could use to identify. But in this case, the head was missing. And we always talk about, don't we, identification purposes.
Yeah.
The head, the hands and things like that. And if something's been submerged in water for that long, say your limb, the fingerprints might not be able to be used for identification. It depends how far the decomposition process has gone at this point.
Yeah, so again, it tells you something about the offender because they've obviously tried really hard to ensure that this victim isn't going to be identified.
And what a mad coincidence, though. For some limbs to be found in the loch, and then the police dive team do a dive in that exact area.
Well, Gordon even said, like, considering the size of the loch, it was crazy.
It blew my mind that when I was like, wow, like that. At first, I thought that's got to be set up for them to
have found
it, and it's going to be fake.
In one sense, obviously, it's completely tragic, but so lucky that it did happen because I don't think that was what sparked the discovery of the victim. Do you know what I mean? And I don't think necessarily they'd have had that otherwise.
Victim's family wouldn't have had closure, would they?
No.
Because they'd have never found the body.
Another thing that I was thinking about, so we know that one of the limbs was a thigh, and a thigh bone is actually really good for extracting DNA. And it did make me wonder whether or not they might have been able to do that at that time, or again, whether or not DNA technology wasn't as advanced.
Yeah, I did think that, to be fair, because as soon as you find something like this, the main focus of the investigation sort of, obviously they want to catch the offender, but they're also looking first point to identify who the victim is, aren't they? But in this case, with it being submerged in water, I'm not 100% sure if it would have been if it would have been doable back then.
So the limbs in the bags were bagged, tagged, processed, and then the scene was handed over to scenes of crime. By this point, obviously, an investigation has now been launched, and in this case, the detective was Stuart Ferguson, and he was leading the charge to try and identify who this victim was. It became a big news story pretty quickly.
As you can imagine, because it's so shocking, and you can just imagine the headlines that would have come out for this.
Yeah.
Limbs in the lock, you know, it's really, really shocking to be reading it and think that's happened anywhere near us, isn't it?
Yeah. And again, because it was quite a quiet, remote area, it would make headlines because, you know, it's not like things like this are happening.
Yeah, every day.
Every day.
Yeah.
It also made me think at first, rather than it being like a serial killer that knows what they're doing in terms of disposing of a body, I thought like gang related.
Yeah, because in Scotland, I know that Glasgow had a really big like sort of gang culture. Is that sort of the way to put it? Gang.
Yeah.
Like
prevalent. It was very prevalent
at the time. And this, something so extreme as this, I think the police would automatically think this has got to be something like gang related.
Organised crime. Yeah.
For it to be so extreme.
Yeah. So an investigation gets underway. They also conduct a search of this whole pier. And again, unfortunately, they discover more bags with more limbs. And so they are finding more and more evidence, more and more body parts. But as you mentioned, unfortunately, they still were not able to find the victim's head.
And just think of how we've already said how big this was. It's almost impossible to send out the dive teams and say, right, cover the rest of it.
Yeah.
And see what you can find, because it'd just take way too long, wouldn't it?
So we have mentioned Barry Wallace, and at this stage, Barry Wallace has just been reported missing. It was 2 days prior. Again, out on his Christmas do, he actually worked at a Tesco. He'd gone to the Christmas party. He had drunk quite a lot, but people said that he was still okay and that he'd gone to the taxi rank to get a taxi.
And with him being 18 as well, it was probably his first Christmas party, so you're bound to go a bit overboard, aren't you? It's your first proper job, you know.
Yeah.
First probably night out with work friends.
Yeah, and apparently they had planned on going to a nightclub. Yeah. So, I mean, if you're sticking it out for that long, you're going to be pretty drunk, aren't you?
Yeah.
But he lived with his parents, and by the Sunday afternoon, his parents still hadn't heard anything from him, which was very unlike him. He'd not returned home. And again, as parents, you kind of think like, oh, has he just ended up kipping it back at someone else's house? Obviously, they've not got things like Find My iPhone, or he can't just text.
Especially with it being...
you would just wait.
Their son as well. Yeah. Like, I think boys are more likely to just go and stay with the friends when they get drunk or something, aren't they? Yeah. Whereas girls are probably...
I don't know. My mum would probably beg to differ.
She'd disagree with you on that one.
Yeah.
So at this point, the police... they know that Barry Wallace has been reported missing, so then they have to start sort of looking to see if he's in hospitals or anywhere. So they're ringing round, seeing if he's being checked into anywhere, seeing if anyone's seen him. And at this point, the last time that someone had actually seen Barry was the night that he went out on the Christmas party at the taxi rank, waiting for a taxi to get home.
Yeah. And again, you just think, what could have gone so horribly wrong in that space of time? Like, if he's already at the taxi rank, he's kind of somewhere safe.
Yeah, he's ready to go home, isn't he?
There's other people there. He's clearly getting straight in the taxi. So then you prime suspect, or, you know, in the direction of, you might be thinking taxi driver. Has a taxi driver committed an offence?
Yeah, and his... parents, Ian and Christine, did a TV appeal at this point, and just to see if anyone had seen him anywhere. And it must be horrible for parents to have to go on TV and do that. You're already grieving, and then you just put in front of a camera and you have to, and you know it's going to help the situation, you know it's raising awareness for it, but I just think it's a It's a really horrible thing for parents to have to do.
Yeah. If you think when you're upset about anything, the last thing you'd want to do is
go on
in
camera.
front of camera. Yeah. And it's just so daunting. Another thing I think as well, they probably wouldn't have maybe thought about it from this perspective, but I do now, knowing what we know. When you think about witness statements and stuff, unfortunately, because it's a night out, your witness statements aren't going to be that reliable if anyone has seen him, because people are likely, it's Christmas time, people are likely to be drunk, inebriated, you know, have either not paid attention to something or thought something was significant, or if they have, they're probably hazy on the details.
Or what you think you've seen, it probably wasn't. And in police interviews, especially when someone's had a drink, you would have to state as well, like how many drinks you'd had on a scale of 1 to 10, like how drunk did you feel? And then if this goes to court and you were called up as a witness, you've got to go through that in court and say, well, I did have 5, 6, 7 drinks on that night.
You'd feel horrible as well, wouldn't you? Because you'd want to be super
helpful
and useful, but whether or not you could be.
Yeah, and as well, when you're drinking, you're not taking as much in of your surroundings.
No.
Whereas now, with, like you said, knowing what we know, sometimes when I go out and you see something that you think might happen or may, or you think, it's like obviously a bit judgy, but like, they might look
just
like
keeping an eye.
Yeah, you're just sort of more aware of it, aren't you? But these people won't have been like that at all.
So the investigation continues. You have got 2 separate investigations running here, just to note. So obviously Barry was reported missing 2 days prior to the Loch Lomond discovery. So you've got a missing persons investigation going on there, and then you've got the investigation of the limbs at this stage and trying to identify who they belong to. So they're running separately as 2 investigations. But then 8 days later, after the discovery of the limbs in Loch Lomond, another discovery was made. Now, this was 60 miles away.
It is so far away, this. And it was on Barassi Beach, is that how you say it?
So.
Yeah. And a human head was found, and it's actually found by someone walking a dog. And we always say dog walkers and runners are usually people to discover things like this.
It's a cliche in Midsummer Murders, but it is
actually true. And it's normally due to the dog. You know, your dog runs off and smells something. We know they've got like a better sense than us.
Yeah.
And in this case, it was actually a human head found on the beach. So again, for the witness there to have discovered that, we probably don't take into consideration as like how
people that
toll that it takes on that person that have discovered
absolutely
the bodies, because that must have been horrific for them as well.
Oh yeah, you can't imagine, because you wouldn't, that visual would never ever leave you, would it?
No. And in this one, it was John Greets was a senior investigating officer, and he was one of the first people on the scene. And he said when he went to have a look, as soon as he saw the head, he thought straight away, that looks like Barry Wallace.
Yeah.
So it's sort of piecing together now, but so far away from each other.
I know.
Like 60 miles away.
And one thing that I found interesting was he was actually at the police station back in Glasgow. So this is at Barassi Beach in Ayrshire, but he's actually back at the police station in Glasgow. So you can tell that it was quite a big case that stretched a great distance, because he's having to then travel out to this scene. Obviously they'd connected that it was likely that the head obviously linked to his case. But yeah, so the area had already been cordoned off by first officers that had attended when it had been reported by the dog walker. But again, John Gates stated that he still pictures it to this day, and it was just absolutely horrific. He was pretty sure that it was him, and that was confirmed a day later. So 9 days after the limbs were discovered, the body was then confirmed to be that of Barry Wallace, who was just 18.
And at this point, then a whole murder investigation, full-scale murder investigation will be launched. So at this point now, we've not got 2 separate investigations going. The missing persons and the murder and finding the limbs and finding the head have all sort of merged into one now, haven't they? So you can just imagine the media frenzy on this as well.
Oh, God,
already
absolutely.
The limbs is already shocking. Then you've got the head, and then it's an 18-year-old boy.
Yeah. And I think throughout this, one thing that did make it difficult was this media involvement and attention that it was receiving, which you can understand, but at the same time, it does often hinder investigations.
Yeah, and this was actually a huge investigation, wasn't it? So an incident room was set up, and there was 8 officers involved in
which
this.
even they said was
big for the time.
Yeah, absolutely. And another thing that is obviously of concern to officers at the time is that because it is so quick to come out in the press, yes, they wouldn't have had social media, but they were worried that the family would find out. They'd have someone knocking on their door asking them how they felt about the discovery of their son's body. So there was obviously a family liaison officer that was assigned to the case, and his name was Johnny Miller. Now, we'll reference him quite a bit in this case, but he
did
just
such a good job, didn't he?
Absolutely incredible as a human. You can tell that he's got the perfect balance of being professional, but then also obviously really felt this case.
He was so really empathetic, wasn't he? Yeah. And he actually travelled, didn't he, to make sure that he gave the news to the parents before he was hoping it would reach them in the press. And he did that a lot of times as well. All the way through, he was always like, I wanted to be straight up and honest with the parents. I promised them that I would never lie to them.
Yeah.
I would never, hold back information from them. And he did just that. And I feel like Ian and Christine really appreciated having him there.
So Ian and Christine were informed by Johnny. He did admit that he'd broken the speed limit in order to try and get there to be able to tell them.
I think they'll forgive him for that one, though.
Yeah, but you just cannot imagine being told something as horrific, because they would have found out about the limbs already. They would have known about that. You've probably got it in the back of your mind that you hope that it isn't the case. But to be told that your son has been murdered in such a horrific way, I just cannot even imagine how that would feel. And then on top of that, and again, there's kind of no other option in these cases, but it is just so heartbreaking. Ian, Barry's father, then had to actually go to the mortuary with Johnny and identify his son's head. And again, it was just the head, unfortunately, that he had to identify. And Johnny, the family liaison, said that it was the bravest thing he's ever seen anyone go and do. And it just took such enormous courage to be able to go through with that.
Yeah. And at the same time, you've got the police putting out an appeal to find anyone who's last seen Barry, and it must be so overwhelming for the family. You've just found out that your son has not just died but been brutally murdered. You've got the press to deal with. You've identified the body.
It's also all Christmas over the newspaper time, which is just again, there's no good time for anything like this to happen, but at Christmas, like, it is all about family and children. And in actual fact, this actually happened because Ian came back from having identified his son, and there was the float that goes past. Now, I don't know whether this happens in other places, but it certainly does where we live. And you have like a Christmas float that goes by.
It's almost like a vehicle, or like a open back lorry
with trailer.
It's basically a trailer with people on the back of it, and they do like maybe singing or performing, and they're dressed up and they're waving to the kids, and people line the streets, don't they, to watch it go past. It's sort of like a annual thing,
and they're raising money for the community. So quite a lot of times it's a local round table, but they're raising money. And so Ian returns to his home. Obviously, again, you would just want to get straight inside and probably hug your wife. But instead, he went inside, got some change, came back outside and donated money. And you just think, what a man, what a brave character. And just like the caring nature, again, it's another one of those moments that would restore your faith in humanity.
Yeah, and even the liaison officer in this case said that is a moment that will stick with him forever, because he couldn't believe what he'd just seen.
Yeah. So again, you've got new detective. So you've got Alan Cotton, who was kind of a new rookie on this inquiry team. He is now a detective, but he was saying that it was incredible to see the amount of officers that were committing their time and dedication to the case.
And back then, he was also quite inexperienced, so he will have been learning on this case. This was probably the biggest case that he learned from.
Yeah.
And being around all those officers who were doing such a good job,
Yeah.
that probably sort of shaped his career
career
moving forward.
And there was an overtime ban in place at that time, which meant that they weren't meant to do any overtime because they couldn't afford to pay them. But he said everyone was doing it regardless because they wanted to get answers. So again, as well as figuring out how this crime's occurred, you've got to try and figure out who the offender is. And they were obviously looking for people that had committed similar offences in terms of either disposing of bodies or injuries that were similar. And they actually received intel from Northumbria police, which again would now come through on kind of a centralised system.
It'd be a lot easier.
But it would... Yeah, if the headlines hadn't have been so big in Scotland, I'm not sure whether the Northumbria would have necessarily known about it.
Yeah, because in this case, we're not even... I think they did move quite quickly as well, because it was only sort of 9 days after the limbs were found that they were looking at a suspect from the intel that had come in.
Yeah.
So 9 days, imagine all that manual work they'd had to do. Whereas now it might have been a bit quicker because you could just put it into a computer and it'd probably sort through it for you.
Yeah.
But I think that was really
incredible,
good, really good work already in terms of the timescale.
So Northumbria police said they had someone that had previously lived within their district and that they'd committed similar offences and, as far as they were aware, had recently moved into the area, into Scotland. So Scottish criminal records then brought up this suspect whose name was William Ian Beggs. He was 36 at the time and he fitted this MO, flagging previous offences. And again, they're liaising with Northumbria, getting as much intel as possible, but they've got no evidence to specifically link him. So you've now got, you've got teams that are trying to link potential evidence, because you can't just say, well, he's committed similar offences in the past, it's definitely him. You've got
we
to
just
have,
suspect you, yeah,
we've got to have the evidence, and also you've got to have the evidence in order to secure a warrant that might give you the evidence. So it's really tricky, but ultimately, because he had committed previous attacks on young men, again, Stuart Ferguson, one of the detectives, had already an awareness of Beggs in Scotland from offences that he'd committed while he was living in Scotland. He'd worked in a call centre, but he'd taught computing at university. So as much as they knew he'd committed these offences, he'd got quite a normal life.
Job and life,
he was leading.
Yeah.
Ultimately, they were able to get a warrant to search his flat. And again, police felt that this was quite an urgent matter because they wanted to preserve any evidence that was potentially, available to them.
Yeah, so when the police got a warrant, they actually had to force entry into Beggs's flat. And they said when they got in there, when you look around at first, he was a bit of a hoarder, wasn't he? So the flat was quite messy, and they thought, wow, this is going to be a bit of a big job for the crime scene investigators to have to sort through sort of all this.
Again, so this was like it looked like a council estate, didn't it, really?
Yeah.
It was called Doon Place, the road that the flat was on. But unfortunately, the press got hold of this as well.
Yeah.
So then they're finding out who lives at this address. They're now broadcasting the fact that Beggs is a prime suspect. The police haven't said that at this stage. They're just wanting to find out information. But because, again, they'd knocked the door down, it obviously looks urgent.
It does.
And then you just create more headlines, unfortunately.
And in this case, when the police entered the flat, William Beggs wasn't actually there.
No.
So I think they had to work pretty quick to release the image of him. to the public before the press did start to make their headlines about anything else. So it was sort of released as, we want to speak to this person, but they have to try and not hold back evidence on purpose. It's not because they don't want to tell you about it, it's because it could hinder the investigation. So they have to be careful about what they're releasing in general with the press.
Yeah. So this raid was 11 days after the discovery, but that's effectively 11 days that Beggs has potentially had to flee and to leave the area.
Or get rid of evidence.
So it is becoming more and more critical. So CSIs worked on his flat for days, but unfortunately they didn't find any significant fingerprints or hairs and fibres, really. However, they did manage to find blood samples, which ultimately would then become a match for Barry's DNA. They found these samples on the washing machine, which was in the kitchen, and then there was some staining on carpet and from a doorknob. But these were tiny, tiny samples, weren't they? They weren't big samples.
They are, and this is the first piece of evidence that actually links Beggs to the case, really.
Yeah.
But with them finding blood that matches Barry in his flat, this is like a definite link, because you know that something has happened in that flat.
Yeah.
You know that there's been some sort of struggle, enough to draw blood, and it is too much of a coincidence at this point, isn't it, for it to be not significant in this case.
So at that point there was then a warrant, not just obviously for the house search, but a warrant for Beggs's arrest. So the warrant was placed, but again, unfortunately, the police have got hold of it, the press have got hold of it at this point. He's had 11 days to hide evidence and potentially flee.
He'll have been so aware of what's going on. He could basically follow his own story in the press and sort of even know where they're looking. You could think, well, you know, this is in the press today in this area, so that's obviously where the police are looking, because that's where the press are. And you can sort of avoid it. And that's what he managed to do. He managed to get to France. He went to Jersey, didn't he? France.
Yeah.
And managed to get actually out of the country.
So when they're creating a profile of their suspect, they found out that Beggs was born in the early 60s. And again, we're not going to go into loads of detail about his background.
No.
But again...
Just a few bits that are relevant.
To give you a bit of an idea, because I do think, again, we talk about how like the face of a killer is someone who was, you know, horrifically abused as a child and things like that.
Or had a traumatic upbringing and
not always the case. So he was very clever when he was young, very articulate. He, in his early teens, he was appearing to struggle with his sexuality. But again, it was a small town that he was from. His parents were religious. So you can understand that someone might struggle with their sexuality if that was the case. In
the community, it wasn't accepted at all at that time, and you couldn't just be open about something like that. Sorry. I was just going to say, I think that led him to sort of go the other way.
Yes.
And is what Beggs did in this case is, even though it looked like he was struggling with his own sexuality, he outwardly became very homophobic.
Yeah. He just completely turned on himself, hid his feelings, and then decided to, and probably hated himself, hated that he had these feelings.
It was probably the only way that he thought, I could cover it up by being so homophobic, so no one suspects me.
Yeah, and I think if you are being told constantly that, you know, being gay is a sin and it's wrong, and these people are, you know, not, well, I don't want to say what homophobic people say, but if you're being constantly told that, then you probably would start to hate yourself. So I think there was a lot of hatred, which, then he did just unfortunately turn on other people.
And you're very on your own as well, because in the community, there'll not be anyone else that is outwardly gay either. No. So you probably will feel like, what's wrong with me? Like, you know, it's not, and people will be telling him it's not normal, and it's just, it's horrible from the start to be struggling with sexuality in that way, isn't it? But ultimately, we have to go back and look at these things and see if this could be something that's led to him being the way that he was.
But not only that, again, he had this high level of intelligence, and he developed like a fascination with violence and knives. And ultimately, even when he was just still at secondary school, he did actually attack a fellow pupil.
Yeah.
And there were then further reports of him actually sexually assaulting other classmates, other pupils, specifically on a Duke of Edinburgh trip that he'd gone on, where apparently he had got into, again, another pupil's sleeping bag and sexually assaulted them. So there are signs that Beggs had this proclivity for violence and sexual violence from quite a young age. So obviously the police are now linking all of these things together. They're gaining more intelligence, but they've also now got the DNA evidence in the flat which directly links him. So they're still trying to track down Beggs, and at this stage they do now confirm to the media that Beggs is their prime suspect, but they are still investigating. And as they're uncovering more and more, they do find that back in 1982, when Beggs was 19, he had committed offences which he had been charged for.
Yeah, so back in 1982, Beggs was just 19 years old, and he'd moved away to go to university. And this might have been him thinking, well, if I move away, you go to uni, it's different sort of people.
Yeah.
And they think he might have chosen Teesside for university because they were a little bit more open, and he could frequent gay clubs and sort of do as he pleased.
Yeah.
But a lot of people sort of in the gay club scene did know of Beggs, didn't they? So he was quite prominent in that scene, but they always said that he was sort of like a bit of a lurker, and he would go to these gay clubs, but he would drive, and he would then be waiting around sort of outside the club at the end of the night for people who were maybe like drunk or had even taken drugs to like offer them a lift home.
Yeah, or to like continue the party.
Yeah, do you want to come back with me and we'll carry on and have a drink? And if you've already had a drink, I mean, we've all been there where you go back to an after party of a friend, or, do you know, it's sort of normal if you don't want to stop, and especially if...
And I think because at this time it was difficult, like there was still such stigma about, being openly gay, that you did feel safe in that community.
You feel included, don't you? Yeah, it's more like you think that they'd be looking out for each other.
Yeah, exactly.
In this.
I think you would have more trust in other people in that community than you would do otherwise, because you've got that relationship already just being in this same community. So it was a club called Rock Shots that was kind of his local, and they did say as well that he didn't kind of wear the same as most others. He would kind of look a bit not unkempt, but like baggy jeans and a shirt. He wasn't kind of fitting in with the rest of the crowd, but he was really well known. And ultimately, it's here that he's believed to have met another of his victims, Barry Oldman, who was 28. And again, Barry had done very similar. Again, I'm going to refer to Barry now as his full name, Barry Oldham, just because obviously we've already been talking about Barry Wallace.
Yeah, so we've got two Barrys in this case.
Yeah, so we don't want to get you confused. But he'd met Barry Oldham, who had also moved, and he'd moved to Teesside from Aberdeen, which again is probably, or was probably, less accepting at the time. And he was actually openly gay, and was looking for work, and again looking for a better gay scene. So ultimately it's at Rock Shots that they believe Beggs first met Barry Oldham.
So it was thought that Barry Oldham actually went home with Beggs in the thoughts that they were going to carry on the party, and then ultimately was drugged in his house and murdered. So later on, a body was found, and it was on like a beauty spot in the hillside.
Cleveland Forest, it was called, up in the North Yorkshire moors, actually. So that is much closer to us.
Yeah. And I saw some of the pictures of this, and it was like where you'd sort of go on walks and maybe go up and watch the sunset. So it was a really beautiful place. But unfortunately, when the body was found, there was injuries to the throat and the limbs, and it looked like someone had tried to dismember the body.
Yeah.
So here's where the links obviously come in the cases.
Yeah. So that was actually 12th of May 1987. So again, a significant time before, and it was believed that this was a deposition site.
Yeah.
Which again would make sense. So you've now got 2 instances of them disposing of the body. And again, in this case, Barry Oldham was believed to have died about 14 or 15 hours prior to him being found.
Yeah, at this time though as well, other people had come forward and said that Beggs had some like strange behaviours, and that when they'd gone home with him and fallen asleep, like he'd tried cutting them.
Yes.
And it was always while they were asleep as well. So it was almost like he drugged his victims, and they were just very in such a vulnerable state, weren't they?
Yeah. And it did appear that he wanted them to be in more of a vulnerable state than, again, you know, there are some offenders that like the violence and they almost like the fear in their victims, but it didn't appear that that was him. He just liked them to be subdued so he could effectively, you know, do what he had this urge to do, really.
Yeah.
But meanwhile, obviously an investigation in this case was going ahead, and a witness had seen that they had noticed a mini traveller, which was a type of vehicle at that time, and that it had been seen leaving the scene at around the time that the body was thought to have been disposed of. And that actually linked back again to Beggs.
To the car that Beggs were driving at the time, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And because witnesses had seen Barry Oldham leaving with Beggs, then obviously when the police investigation started for this murder, Beggs at this point had become the main suspect.
Yeah.
So similar to the Barry Wallace case, it sort of unfolds very similar, doesn't it?
Yeah.
His flat was searched, and police do find blood in Beggs's flat that does belong to Barry Oldham.
Yeah.
So, you know, even though this is before the murder of Barry Wallace, it seems
Goes
like
to
he's got a
show-
very similar MO, and he doesn't divert from it, does he?
No, and it also goes to show that, you know, offenders just cannot get away with it. Like, you know, you might have thought that he'd have figured he'd learnt from his mistakes.
And
either
Beggs
that or he was just that dead set on committing these crimes. He didn't really care.
He wasn't really bothered. But he did actually say, Beggs said in an interview that he'd never even met Barry Oldham and that he didn't know anything about him.
Yeah.
But ultimately, Beggs was arrested at his parents' house.
Yes, again, he'd fled.
Yep.
Fled back to his parents' house, was arrested there, then again taken back to wait for trial, effectively. So he was escorted back to North Yorkshire for questioning. Again, they'd also found blood in the back of Beggs' car because he'd put a tent in the car, which had then got blood on it. They've now got witness statements because someone else did come forward and give Beggs' name about them having woken up, you know, being injured by Beggs. And there was also evidence at his parents' home as well. So that would ultimately lead to him being or standing trial for the murder, and that was in 1987. And the defence again claimed that they decided to go camping together.
Yeah.
Now again, how unlikely is this story? Do you know what I mean? Like, who on I mean, I've gone on some pretty wild first dates, but I would never say, oh yeah, let's go into the middle of nowhere.
Just
and
us two,
camping.
out of the way of any civilization, and just go camping when you don't know the person.
No.
It doesn't.
And
it
after
doesn't
a night
add up.
out, the last thing that you would want to do
Is camp.
Is go camping. Yeah. Like, it just doesn't make any sense. But that's what his defence claimed. They then said, which is unfortunately what quite a lot of offenders do and blamed the victim. So they said that Barry Oldham was actually the one to first come at Beggs with a knife, and then he had tried to defend himself. He'd later passed out, and when he woke up, he realised that Barry Oldham was dead, panicked, and then left. So the prosecution just said that doesn't make any sense because, again, there was so much DNA and blood evidence in Beggs's flat, which, yes, you can have secondary transfer, but with blood evidence, especially in the way it's been found, it'd be dried by that point, so it just wouldn't transfer as easily.
It just doesn't make sense because Beggs had said everything happened out of the house, so there's no reason for any blood or any evidence to be in the house at all, is there?
No. Again, there was a 15-inch cut actually to Barry Oldham's knee, which is just, again, horrific, isn't it? There was also witnesses that had come forward, and again, this is a kind of a nod or a further evidence of Beggs's interest in piquerism, which is, again, when people get satisfaction, enjoyment from cutting either themselves or other people and seeing blood. So ultimately, Beggs was found guilty. This was a unanimous decision and he was sentenced to life in prison. He also then got an additional 4 months for the assaults that he'd made against other victims. At this stage, Beggs then appeals his conviction on the grounds of bad character evidence. And again, this is so difficult because some of what these witnesses were saying was obviously, it was all factual, but it was whether or not it could be proven.
Yeah, and it's sort of their opinion, isn't it? When you're giving an opinion on someone's character, it's not solid evidence. Yeah.
So ultimately, unfortunately, because of this technicality, Beggs was acquitted of this whole murder case.
It just shows how small of something and how the police have to make sure they've done a thorough job so something like this doesn't happen, because it must be really horrible for the victims' families.
Because Beggs didn't even serve 2 years of a life sentence for murder because of this one technicality.
Yeah.
So that was the prior murder case, which the police in Scotland are now learning about and discovering. But ultimately, they've still got a manhunt out for Beggs, who is a missing person at this stage. Well, a wanted person. They are trying to get as much information about where he might have fled to as possible when they get a huge breakthrough. Yeah. And this actually comes from the Dutch police, and they call via Interpol to say that Beggs had walked into one of their police stations after 14 days on the run and ultimately handed himself in.
Yeah, it's mad because we've spoke about the Dutch police before, but in this case, it's because of the extradition rules, isn't it?
Yeah. It's very likely that Beggs knew exactly what he was doing. He's now got away with murder once before based on appeals. And so he's thought, right, okay, I'm going to head over there. Unlikely to get extradited and I'll be free.
He just knows the system, doesn't he? And I think that put more pressure on the Scottish police as well, because they just knew that they had to have a really solid, airtight case to prevent this from happening again.
So officers in Amsterdam take Beggs's fingerprints. They come up as a match on the database. So he was arrested, but again then refused to speak at his extradition hearing. And I'm just going to give you a couple of dates that give you an indication of timeline at this point. So on the 11th of April in 2000, the Dutch court granted extradition for Beggs to then have to go back to Scotland for his trial in the Barry Wallace case. However, Beggs then appealed and stated that because of all the media attention, he couldn't receive a fair trial. So the appeal then goes to the Justice Minister on the 26th of September. On the 15th of November, that appeal is upheld, but Beggs appeals again.
There's a process here where, there's only so many times you can appeal.
Yeah.
And at some point it's going to get to the final appeal in this, isn't it?
And in this case, it was on the 5th of January in 2001 that this final appeal was then rejected. But that's been going on then since April. So from April to January, it's then been a back and forth between Beggs and whether or not he's going to be extradited to
stand trial. I do think, though, it's such a long process from start to finish, and there's a lot goes on that you don't see behind the scenes. And while there's all this backwards and forwards with the appeals going on, it gives the Scottish Police chance to get all their case together and make sure it is solid.
Yeah. And they now know that he's got away with it once before.
And they don't want that to happen again. No. Like, that's the last thing you want if you're on the case.
So much so that they decided to re-examine Beggs's flat in Scotland, Doon Place. And when they went, they'd noticed previously that part of the flat had been kind of half redecorated almost.
And if you see the pictures of the flat, it's not somewhere that he looked like he cared about. He didn't take pride in his home.
No.
We've already said he was a bit of a hoarder. It didn't look that tidy or clean, did it? So one area that's been decorated, it was just one specific room, will have really stood out to the officers. And they obviously thought that as well and started stripping the wallpaper off the walls, having a look underneath.
Yeah, there was new varnish on the floor, so they decided to pull up floorboards. But they'd also, I don't know whether you remember, we referenced earlier on about a piece of carpet that had got a little blood stain on.
Yep.
They believed that there was a bigger piece of carpet that had been removed and disposed of. So they actually got a team of 30 officers to search a nearby waste ground where all of the tip rubbish would get deposited, which is just a horrific job. And you'd be there for hours and hours and days trying to find this one piece of carpet. Ultimately, they unfortunately didn't find it. However, back at the flat, when they lifted floorboards, they found stains which are likely from blood pooling, the size of dinner plates.
Which is crazy if you think about like how much blood it will have been that's dripped through the floor as well.
We're talking about multiple stains.
Yeah, and we an expert could actually say from the amount of blood that was at that crime scene, even if they didn't have a body, the amount of blood there would have come from significant injury, and if they'd not got medical attention, then you are looking at someone who has died.
Ultimately, the DNA samples in those blood samples would match Barry Wallace, as well as DNA samples from Beggs, which were from sweat, which means, again, that he has been exerting a lot of... What's the word?
Power.
Yeah. And then, unfortunately, further DNA samples from blood, which are believed to have been from other victims.
It's so sad, isn't it? And I think with the blood and the sweat, it just shows how much of a fight Barry Wallace put up right to the end.
Yeah. So we talk there a little bit about other victims, and in this case, there are victims that thankfully did manage to survive, and we're going to talk about a couple of surviving victims now. Again, there's a lot more out there if you want to do your own research. We are going to concentrate on the Barry Wallace case just in terms of timing today, but there is a lot more evidence and information out there.
You can see interviews with these and hear it firsthand from them if you want to.
Yeah. So ultimately, a man came forward in this case to say that he had been a victim of Beggs, and this was Brian McQuillan. And I think if it hadn't have been for how Brian dealt with the situation, he unfortunately would have been one of
the victims. So what happened is Brian McQuillan went home after a night out with Beggs, went back to his house to carry on the drinking, and McQuillan wasn't really a big drinker.
No.
And he said he didn't really know what different alcohol would taste like. So Beggs gave him a beer.
And it
or
was
lager,
a bottle of Grolsch, and
yeah.
Grolsch isn't great either.
No. So he started drinking it and said that it didn't quite taste right, but he couldn't put his finger on what it was. And he thought, oh, is it just a different kind of beer or something that I've not had before? But very soon after drinking it, became very drowsy and eventually ended up passing out.
When Brian then woke up, he was in the bedroom and he noticed that his leg was being suspended in the air, that Beggs was between his legs, and that Beggs was cutting his thigh. And he got a sudden rush of just excruciating pain. Now, I cannot imagine how terrifying that would feel.
Yeah, because you've got the pain and you've got the adrenaline, you've got your survival instincts,
You've
everything's
got
kicking
an
in.
overbearing person on top of you.
Yeah.
But ultimately, again, Brian was able to push his way away from Beggs and fled towards the bedroom door to try and leave. Again, he didn't even think that he would make it out of the room, and Beggs did then grab him by the wrists, and Brian recalls him saying quite calmly, just come back to bed, it'll all be over soon. You've made me do this.
It's just so chilling, isn't it? And you just think you're not going to think you're going to get out alive from that.
No.
Because it's not even as if something's happened in a rage and they've calmed down.
He is calm.
Yeah, this is
he
him
knows
calm.
what he's
Yeah,
doing.
yeah.
And Brian at that stage, again, such quick thinking, but actually jumped from a first story window from Beg's flat out into like a communal garden space. And he didn't even say that he'd done that to save his own life.
This was actually really... I don't know how he went through this thought process, but he wasn't trying to save his life when he jumped out the window. He thought he was going to die in the process of jumping out of the window, but at least someone would have known about it. At least someone would know what's happened.
And who Beggs was, which is just incredible to think about other people in that.
When you're trying to
survive, it's just... Yeah, it's crazy.
So luckily the neighbour saw him and came out, and she said he'd only got, I think he got his pair of boxers on or something, and she went and covered him up and obviously rang the police.
Yeah.
When the police came round, they obviously found out what had happened there, and ultimately Beggs was arrested, and he was found guilty and received a 6-year sentence for this. And he had to have a psychiatric evaluation done on him as well to see, because of the nature of the offences and the nature of the assault, they thought maybe something might be wrong with him.
Maybe.
And when they did it, they found he was fully of sound mind.
Yeah.
So there was nothing.
Yeah.
That was how he is.
And ultimately, he would only serve 3 years of that 6-year sentence before then being released in 1994.
And we actually have something now which they call the VISA, so it's the Violent and Sex Offenders Register, which at this point he would have been released and gone on to that register, so there would have been a trace of him on there.
Yeah.
But back then they didn't actually have that, so once he's released from prison, it's almost like, okay, there's no register for you to go on, so there's no sort of trace.
So Beggs was released in 1994, and then in 1996 there is also further evidence that he was still committing these assaults on men, because a man called Shane Cox came over from Michigan with some of his college friends for a holiday to Scotland.
They want to do like a UK trip. I think they were uni friends, weren't they? So they must have been quite young at the time.
Yeah. And so they decided, again, to frequent some of the pubs in Scotland and got talking to Beggs. At that point, they said that Beggs came across, like friendly. He'd bought them all a round of beer, and they'd then gone back to the hostel, and Beggs had also gone back to this hostel with them.
They said it was like bunk beds, wasn't there? So there was, I think, 6 of them all in bunk beds, but within the same room.
Shane said that he had started to feel fuzzy, and when he'd woken up in his bunk bed, Beggs was beside him in the bed, and that's not how he remembered going to sleep. He was disorientated and confused, and did alert one of his other friends to it. But ultimately, he said that he tried to stay awake but couldn't because it was likely that he had been drugged. But by the time he then woke up again, Beggs had gone and disappeared. So they did actually report this to the police. But again, unfortunately, because the boys were drunk, because it's likely that Shane had been drugged, there wasn't enough evidence. However, there were knife slits in their sleeping bags. Again, at kind of thigh level.
That takes it right back and links into the Duke of Edinburgh, to his offences that he were committing when he was still at school, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Again, there was then reference to another case where a victim, reportedly a German student in this case, had gone back to Beggs's flat. Beggs had actually cooked for him, but he then believed that the food had been drugged because he woke up several days later.
Do you think he kept drugging him?
Yeah,
For
potentially.
it to be several days,
Didn't know whether or not he'd been sexually assaulted because he had no memory of those days. But again, it sounds like for whatever reason, Beggs had let him go after those several days, and whether or not it's because he knew that he was drugged to a level that he wouldn't have any
remember.
recollection.
That's what I think.
But Beggs does seem to have like real targets, because he was friends with another man who he'd met in 1996. This is a man called Richard Bash, I believe is the pronunciation. And Richard met Beggs at university. They became really good friends. They said they used to have really in-depth conversations with each other. Interestingly, they used to take trips up to the countryside and go for big long walks in the countryside. But Richard was an openly gay man and would actually speak to Beggs about men.
Yeah.
And it does sound like Beggs was a little bit more open with Richard.
Yeah, it does, because he would talk to him quite openly, wouldn't he?
Yeah.
Because on the weekend of the 4th and 5th of December in 1999, just before Barry Wallace went missing, Beggs had actually rang his friend Richard and said, "Oh, I've met a boy the night before. I can't remember what he called him, a sweet young man.
Yes.
I met a sweet young man the night before." So he must have been comfortable enough to be open with Richard about it. Maybe because Richard was so open about it as well.
But again, Richard hasn't had any of these instances where he feels like he's been drugged. He never felt threatened by Beggs, was never assaulted by Beggs. So it does seem like he had real specific targets.
Yeah, it must have been. But when he actually said, when Beggs said to Richard that he had met a boy the night before, he was driving at the time. And Richard could hear that from obviously the background of everything. And when all this came out in the press, Richard actually went to the police and said, "I did have this phone call with Beggs, and I don't know if it'll be important or not, but I think he thought I'd better come forward and say this anyway." When the police looked at the timeline, it matched up to when Barry Wallace disappeared. So they think on the phone that Beggs was actually talking about meeting this sweet young boy who was, in fact, Barry Wallace.
Yeah, which is just horrific to think.
It's horrible, isn't it? But this evidence is sort of what's ultimately going to link together the case, isn't it?
Yeah. So the trial did begin. So again, Beggs was extradited, came back from Amsterdam, and on the 18th of September 2001, the trial began. And this is 12 months after being held in the Netherlands.
Yeah.
Again, he's finally then tried for the murder of Barry Wallace at the High Court in Edinburgh. It was obviously so incredible. If you think about the amount of man hours that all of this, the inquiry team, the investigation team have put into this.
Yeah.
You've got the family liaison officer. Everyone is so invested in the case at this point, and they knew that Beggs would fight the prosecution tooth and nail throughout the trial.
Like we've said, he's been through this before. He knows how the process works. He will do anything he can to sort of shake it up and get away with it, won't he?
Yeah. Richard, again, did say initially that he'd be a witness if necessary, and didn't realise how significant he would be in this case.
Yeah, and I think until all the evidence comes out in court, a lot of people don't know really how serious the case is or what evidence they've got. Because if it's your friend, at first he might have thought, I'm not actually sure it's him, so I don't want to go against him and and make it worse for him. But I think as the evidence came out, Richard said in the end, I'll do whatever it takes to nail him, didn't I?
Yeah. So ultimately, throughout trial, the prosecution suggested that, again, Barry Wallace had last been seen at the taxi rank. They then believed that he was picked up by Beggs and taken back to his flat. The defence then said that this was a sex game gone wrong, and I'm not even going to start on that one.
We've heard it a few times in cases, haven't we?
Yeah, it's unbelievable. Ian, Barry's father, stated that he didn't really know... Well, he didn't believe that this was the case because his son had never shown any kind of gay tendencies.
Or any signs
of
being
gay. Again, you just don't know, but ultimately they believe that it was at Beggs's flat that Barry was murdered. And again, this links back to the references of him kind of cruising for gay men late at night.
Yeah.
But they needed to know in trial how Barry Wallace had actually been killed. And forensic evidence suggested that it was likely a kitchen knife that Beggs had used.
So they found the knife, didn't they? And it had been cleaned. But the thing with a knife, where the handle joins to the blade, if you take that apart or you swab right down at the bottom of there, blood can get stuck in between the handle and the blade where they join together, and that's what it was in this case. So they did actually find a kitchen knife with Barry's blood between the blade and the handle. Then we've got Barry's blood that was found in the car. We've got his blood that was found in the house as well.
In the house, yeah. And they also found signs that Barry had been restrained, so it did look like he had struggled during his death, unfortunately. So there were the 4 weeks worth of evidence in this trial, and then the jury obviously then went out to decide the verdict and consider the evidence.
It was quite a quick one again in this one. 2 hours, 15 minutes it took for William Beggs to be found guilty.
And it was on a majority verdict, which again shows how difficult it is to get a unanimous.
Yeah, because we think there's loads of evidence there. How was it not unanimous?
It just goes to show. Ultimately, Beggs was sentenced to 20 years in prison. This was in 2001. As of 2024, he was still incarcerated. However, he has, of course, appealed and raised multiple claims against the authorities, and they now believe that he has probably cost the taxpayer over £1 million in legal aid.
Wow.
So it's just unbelievable. And goes to show the kind of person that Beggs is. He's just got no remorse for any of his victims whatsoever. And again, Richard, his friend that ended up having to testify, said that Beggs didn't even look at him when he was stood in front of him. So it's just unbelievable, really.
And he was actually never retried for the murder of Barry Oldham either.
He can't be, though, could he?
No.
Yeah.
No.
So horrific. But at least now he's serving a life sentence. So, again, I think it's important just to bring it back to Barry Wallace. He was alive from 1981 until 1999. He was just 18, and his dad gave a really powerful statement at the funeral of Barry and at the press conference after Beggs was sentenced. And he said, Barry was a wee specky 4-year-old, a gangly teenager and a budding DJ. God bless you, son. You will never be out of our hearts and thoughts.
Oh.
And I thought that was really nice.
It's nice to end on that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So hopefully you managed to stay with us for that one. It was quite a tricky one.
It was.
Again, to research, but then hopefully we've told it in a way that you could keep up with. So, as always, thank you ever so much for listening. Again, if you've got any suggestions for other cases for us to cover, please do let us know.
Let us know. Messages.
Yes. Thank you, as always, and take care.
Bye.